Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's the first of the 2 extra episodes that we're putting out this week, giving another sample of the 50 episodes that are now available for you if you sign up on PPF+. We put these 2 episodes out last summer when there were not quite as many bonus episodes as there are today, but you're going to hear another selection from the archive. If you sign up to PPF+, and it is very straightforward, you'll have heard me say this before, you just need to click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. You will get our entire archive of bonus episodes straight away. It costs £5 per month or £50 for the year, and you will get 2 bonus episodes every month going forward. You also get ad-free listening, and you get automatic sign-up to our newsletter. We are an independent podcast. We're not part of any big podcast stable. And we do rely on PPF+ subscriptions. It is a way of supporting this podcast, of keeping us going and growing. We are immensely grateful to everybody who signs up to PPF+. And we just wanted to give you an idea of what's there waiting for you. You're going to hear clips from 5 of our bonus episodes in our archive. There's no single theme here. These are episodes about big ideas. It's what we try and do on PPF. Some of the ideas are quite dark. We're doing 2 of these episodes of highlights. The next one is going to be a little bit lighter. Today, it's a little bit darker. You are going to hear me talking about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. That was part of our series on thinking about thinking machines. And I'm talking about what Frankenstein tells us about revenge, about objectification, but also about democracy. You are going to hear me talking about the Futurist Manifesto. That was part of our series on revolutionary ideas and the connection between futurism and fascism. As part of our series on great political films, I talked on PPF+ about Claude Lanzmann's Shoah, probably the film in that series that meant the most to me, his epic, unforgettable documentary about the Holocaust. The question of who knew, who had to know, and who, for whatever reason, couldn't bear to know what was really happening. The final extract is a bit more upbeat. It's from a conversation with the historian Chris Clark in our Revolutionary Ideas series. Chris Clark was our guide to the revolutions of 1848, but in this extract we talk about the idea of liberalism and the future prospects of liberal politics, the idea that will not die. To start another conversation, again as part of the Great Political Film series, I talk to Helen Thompson about Apocalypse Now, her favourite political film and maybe mine too. This is a conversation about the idea of America. Apocalypse Now is routinely described as a war movie. It is in that genre. And Heart of Darkness is not a war book. Depends what word you want to characterize the Belgian occupation and exploitation of the Congo, but war isn't the right word for it. It's an imperial exploitation. And Heart of Darkness is a book about empire. And the film seems to me it's sort of both in a way. It's often described as the Great Vietnam War movie, one of the great war movies. But given the source material and the setup and the structure, the narrative arc of it, going upriver deeper and deeper into the jungle, as in Conrad's story, it's also a film about empire. And again, we'll come on to, there's a famous complicated scene in which the Americans encounter the French, who were the imperial power in Vietnam, and they have a conversation about what is the meaning of being in this land. But I'm not even clear in my own mind it's a war movie. Do you think it's a war movie?
No, like you, I thought quite a lot about this since watched it again over the last few weeks. I've watched it twice over the last few weeks again. I think it's actually not a war movie. It's not about empire. I think it's about American culture and the violence that's inherent to American culture, and that has got a new form in the 60s and 70s. So 60s when the story's set, because it seems to be set in the last months of 1969, and then the 70s in terms of when the film is being made about rock and roll American culture. And I mean rock and roll in like the broadest sense of what that means, not just music, but the counterculture, the drugs. And in that sense, I think there is a parallel with Heart of Darkness, because you could say that what Heart of Darkness is about in directing its critique of empire in the way in which it does is how European culture and its obsession with acquisition and conquest has led to this moment. I think that there's a line in Heart of Darkness where Marlowe, the narrator, says something like, all Europe went into making Kurtz. And I think you could then say in Apocalypse Now, all America went into making Kurtz, even though he thinks that he, being Kurtz, I mean by that, he's escaped that. He's providing this critique of America, and particularly perhaps rock and roll America. Actually, and Marlon Brando's casting kind of reinforces this in a way, and then, you know, his huge weight is that he's as much the product of it and destroyed by it as the rock and rollers, so to speak, on the boat with Willard are going to meet their early death, or most of them are.
Yeah, and I also had that feeling. So when you watch it, you know, all of these associations spring to mind, but one of them is clearly sort of Charles Manson style madness. So the Doors soundtrack, and there are some sequences that feel like they're a kind of helter-skelter version of America just transplanted into the jungle.
I think this time, I have to say, in this way, go back to that question of yours I didn't answer, David, at the beginning about what you get out of watching different versions of the film. So this was the first time that I'd watched the director's cut. And I don't think I'd ever really thought about the film as a film critiquing rock and roll America before. But this time, that kind of overwhelmed me, like pretty much from, you know, the first scenes. And once you've seen it, it's everywhere. I mean, both from the way that the Doors, the end is starting, when Willard's, Martin Sheen's narration starts on the boat, he says something like, his crew was mainly rock and rollers heading for a premature death, something like that. There's that moment which you've sort of alluded to. I can't remember quite where in the sequence it comes down the river. I think it's before that they get to the bridge, where one of them has got a newspaper and reading the newspaper out loud, and it's all about the Manson killing of Sharon Tate, film star bound up with all that, that Kurtz then can be cast into the Manson place as someone who's inspiring this really darkly disturbed kind of religious, sexual, whatever it is, leadership over these people in a cult-like fashion, all bound up with violence. And then when you get to the bridge scene, it's completely psychedelic. It's like you're almost like hallucinating watching it. And the Lance character, who's been bound to the beginning with another aspect, I think, of rock and roll American culture, the surfing. He's the one who's on the water skis to Rolling Stones' I Can't Get No Satisfaction. And then he's literally tripping LSD as the bridge is being blown up and then it's rebuilt the next morning, and etc. And you do look like you're watching a trip. That's kind of what I imagine it would feel like, and particularly that moment where Martin Sheen's character asks someone, like, who's in charge here? And the guy says, aren't you?
And then he comes back and someone says to him, who's in charge? And he says, no one is in charge, implying in America, we've just seen a version of America. And there's also the celebrated uncomfortable scene with the Playboy bunnies, where they're shipped in by helicopter and they perform to rock and roll in front of this baying mob of soldiers, and order breaks down and it's a kind of bacchanalian riot. And this is the thing that Kurtz, we get a little bit of Kurtz's writing and thinking, and one of the things that Kurtz says is, we'll never win this war if we keep shipping in Playboy bunnies. But the scene that we see when that happens is not a million miles from what we discover upriver with Kurtz. All the way through the film, the thing that Kurtz is critiquing is just a version of the thing that he's recreated in Cambodia.
No, that's what I absolutely think. And I think that that's why it is in the end that Kurtz is destroyed by the very same thing that he says is the reason why the Americans won't win the war. I think actually in that list, when he's saying they're dilettantes in Vietnam, he goes on about the things that the soldiers think that they can't do without. And one of them is rock and roll. And it seems to be saying, this seems to me a pretty strange critique actually of the Americans in Vietnam, but it's what comes out quite forcefully in the film is a critique of decadence. The soldiers, whether they be the ones on the boat or whether they be the ones watching the concert or in the Kilgore scenes, is they want all these the paraphernalia of contemporary America, and they think they can't live without that. And that's much, much more important to them than actually fighting this war. And I think as well, in that scene with the play bunnies, that guy who comes in and is the host of it, he is, I think, an organizer of these very large rock concerts in California. And I'm never quite sure the dates when these things happen in the late 1960s, but there is that festival in California, it's in Altamont, where actually people die.
Yeah, the Rolling Stones got the Hells Angels to do the security. And that's, it feels a bit like what we see in this film. So we're given, through the Martin Sheen character, Willard, an account of the career of Colonel Kurtz. And he's given a dossier. So he's tasked with going upriver to terminate him with extreme prejudice. That's the phrase that's used. And he's given a dossier explaining how this man went rogue. So he was the golden boy of the US Army, and we're told that he was on track to be a general, Joint Chiefs, all of that. I think at one point, and this is an echo definitely of Heart of Darkness, at one point one of the characters says, he was heading to the top of the corporation. They call it the corporation. And in Heart of Darkness, crucially, it's the corporation that they're working for here. It's not a state or a government. But they call the US military industrial complex the corporation. And this man was heading for the top. He was a star graduate at West Point. He was the golden boy. And then he went early to Vietnam, and he was tasked with writing a report, we're told. And in 1964, he writes a report that lands up on the desk of LBJ, the president. And at that point, everything starts to go wrong, in the sense that whatever's in this report means that he can no longer head to the top of the corporation. And we get glimpses of it in this counterinsurgency manual that he's clearly written a little later. I think it's 65, 66, which has this stuff about we will never win unless we toughen up. We could win this war with a lot fewer men, but harder men. But what do you think I really found myself wondering this while watching it. I want to see the 1964 report. What do you think Kurtz wrote on his first trip that meant he could no longer pursue his path within the corporation?
I think there's two different things here, isn't it? Because on the one hand, at that point, as I read it, he is choosing to walk away, because that's the point when he decides that he's leaving, and he has to ask, I think, is it 3 times or something?
Yeah, and he wants to, age 38, he wants to join the Green Berets, and the next oldest guy on the course was half his age. So there's a lot of proving he's a real man still. But it's also implied that the establishment reject his report.
I think there's two things, though. I think those two things are different in the sense, like, on the one hand, he said something that's completely, some truth, if you like, or that's the big way, that's completely unacceptable. So what is it that he said that's unacceptable? But then I think that his breakdown, we can call it that, the point in which he can no longer be on the path to the top, even if he wanted to be, is later when he's gone off and done that Operation Archangel, I think it's called, which is his own offensive in 67, was it 67 or 68? I can't remember. But you could look at the first one, what's in that March 1964 report, I think, and say that it's the war's not winnable, or that South Vietnam is not a viable state. Because at that point, March 1964, there are no American troops and soldiers in Vietnam. There's only American military advisors in Vietnam. And that it's a more sane response in some sense, which is that nationalism, Vietnamese nationalism, means that it's untenable.
Some of the things that the creature does are almost portrayed in this book as mimicking imperial power, the power of something that is stronger than anyone or anything that can put in its way, and treats all resistance as something simply to be extinguished, which is what the creature does. The creature isn't sadistic. The creature, in a way, isn't particularly cruel. But the creature teaches itself to be indifferent. And that's human too. To use slightly off-putting contemporary language, the thing about the creature is a subject. It is subjective. We get to see inside its head. We feel its feelings. We are conscious of its consciousness. We recognize that it suffers. The suffering of the creature is as poignant as anything in this book. It is a fully subjective subject. And yet everyone all the other humans treat it as an object. It gets no sympathy, it gets no understanding. Not only does it not get any love, it doesn't even get recognition that it might have thoughts. It is treated like an animal, like a beast. It is completely othered by the others, in the way, you might say, that human beings other human beings for whom they have no sympathy. Different religions, different races. The history of empire is the history of imperial conquest in which other human beings are treated as belonging to a different species. And when that happens, we know from history, the creature knows because the creature's read the books. The creature has read the books about how Rome was built, and it's not pretty. It is monstrously cruel. Human beings are capable of the most monstrous cruelty to other human beings when they do not see them as subjects, not in the political sense, but as having a subjectivity which is comparable to the subjectivity of the person performing the act. The creature is othered in the way that human beings treat the human beings for whom they have no feelings. It's as though the creature learns that human sympathy is not limitless. It is actually quite parsimonious. It is shared deeply with the people immediately around other human beings, but the further you get, the less sympathy there is, to the point where, at some distance, there is often no sympathy at all. And no sympathy is indifference. It doesn't mean sadism and cruelty and violence. It just means indifference. But where there is indifference, there is no barrier to cruelty and violence, because the only barrier to cruelty and violence is fellow feeling. This is without thinking about the political implications of the rule of law and everything else. There's another story to be told there, a story that also might go through Rousseau. The creature doesn't get that far in its learning. It doesn't actually think about politics. It has a very raw understanding of the world of power, which is that if you can be inside the circle of sympathy, you are safe. And if you are outside the circle of sympathy, you are profoundly vulnerable. The creature discovers that there is no way into the circle of sympathy for it. There is no circle for it. That point is disappeared. It's vanished. So it is just an outsider, in which case it will give to humans what humans give it. It will reciprocate. This is a story about human understanding as being experienced as reciprocation. So the creature, all it does is it reciprocates. It reciprocates horror with horror. And it does it because, to use a very 21st century term, it has been objectified. And if you objectify human beings, you cannot expect sympathy in return. Now, unsurprisingly, I think lots of people have tried to read a political message into this story. From the moment it was published, there have been attempts to see this as an allegory for a way of thinking about the world of politics and power. So I've offered one, even just as I was doing it there, I realized I've said it's an allegory for empire. And I think maybe it is an allegory for empire and the treatment of other peoples, other races, other cultures. In the 1820s, after it was published, a period of political ferment in England and in Europe, the very, very early dawn of democracy, the reform movements in England that were to lead gradually to the enfranchisement of the adult population, the male population first. At that time, many people on the conservative side of politics saw this as an allegory about the dangers of democracy. The creature is vengeful, and the reason the creature is vengeful is that it has been brought to life by a creator who cannot control it. That's a crude reading of this book, I think, but it's how some people read it. And so they said, what we are being offered here is a warning about what will happen if you bring the people, the mob, the crowd, the mass, to life. If you give them, inject them with political energy, not literal electricity, but political energy. One of the ways you will do that, the conservatives would say, is by enfranchising them. If you give them power, if you give them the vote, what you will have done is build a kind of Frankenstein's monster. That is, maybe with good intentions, maybe because you're a romantic, maybe because you believe that this is a way to get closer to the heart of how things are meant to be. Maybe because you're a political alchemist and you think you can turn base metal into gold. You can't. It's still at some level base metal, but you've given it a kind of artificial life. And its lack of control and your lack of control over it will come back to haunt you. If you give the people power, in the end, they will throttle you in your beds because they are not you. They are monstrous. This is the conservative view. They are monstrous. And therefore, the moral, I think everyone who reads Frankenstein gets that the basic moral is be careful what you wish for. But from that point of view, the political moral is be careful about your good intentions when it comes to bringing to life things that would be better off left moribund, left inanimate, lacking the animation that allows it to act. The people, which is a version of the body politic, the people, the artificial entity, will in the end wreak revenge on its creators. That's the conservative view. But there was also, in the 19th century, a socialist reading. Indeed, there was a Marxist reading. In the Marxist reading, the creature is not the mob. The creature is the proletariat. The proletariat, which is given life by the capitalist classes, fed to a certain degree, miserably, but fed and sort of housed, but under miserable conditions, like the creature. Miserably, horribly fed and housed, but nonetheless exists because capitalism brings the proletariat into creation. There is no proletariat in the pre-capitalist world, in the world of agriculture. But when industry comes, something is made that didn't exist before, an artificial thing. The proletariat is an artificial entity. It's not natural. There is no proletariat in nature. Humans have made the proletariat, which is made up of human parts, body parts, and the capitalists have no option but to objectify the proletariat. So some capitalists might feel some sympathy for these miserable creatures that they have built with their factories and their exploitative practices and their mindless pursuit of the profit motive. They may have some sympathy with them, but in the end, one, they can't understand them because there is a class gulf that cannot be bridged. But two, they can't afford to understand them. If the capitalists sympathize with the proletariat, they will realize that their days are numbered, the capitalist days are numbered. So they have to objectify them. They have to stifle sympathy. And we know that if you stifle sympathy, what you will get in return is vengeance. What you will get in return from the people who you have objectified is that when their subjectivity is expressed, it will have no time and no sympathy for you. So depending on your political preference, this can either be a story about revolutionary emancipation, if you sympathize with the creature, which, frankly, if you read the book, it's quite hard not to sympathize with the creature, or it can be a warning about the risks of popular rule, of populism, if you sympathize with the creator. But at some level, I think these political readings are too crude and they're contrived. They are clearly a contrivance. I don't think Mary Shelley thought of this as primarily a political book. It's a warning about science, about the arrogance of science, about the arrogance of particularly men and their ambition to penetrate the mysteries of the world. But it's a romance. It's an incredibly moving story. It's a love story between Victor and his creature. Futurism does survive the First World War, and Marinetti survived the First World War. He fought in the Italian army, and he actually joined a regiment of cyclists who fought in the mountains on bikes, not very successfully. It's hard to imagine. That didn't work, didn't have cars, so he just fought. He was wounded, but he survived. He took part in a number of battles, and he made some new friends. And one of the friends that he made was a man called Benito Mussolini. In 1919, Marinetti wrote another manifesto. It's not an update of the Futurist Manifesto. It's a new manifesto for a new political party. It's a very short document, even shorter than the Futurist Manifesto, and it was called the Fascist Manifesto. So Marinetti wrote the founding document of Mussolini's fascists, which is a shocking thing. It sounds shocking. Futurism becomes fascism. It's worth reading the 1919 Fascist Manifesto because one of the things that's shocking about it is it's a very unshocking document. It's almost kind of hard to imagine Marinetti writing it because it's very tame and cautious and it's pretty reasonable. The Fascist Manifesto is in favour of a minimum wage, minimum retirement age being dropped from 65 to 55. So it wants people to be able to retire at 55. It wants an 8-hour working day. It wants a wealth tax. It wants an abolition of church privileges. It's a manifesto for a political party that one could imagine being very popular, offering the workers in particular many of the things that would have seemed great. Minimum wage, shorter working day, earlier retirement. So you might think, but yeah, it must have also had all that other stuff in it. It doesn't. It really doesn't. It touches on, hints at a kind of militarism. It hints at a slightly weird possibility of not a personality cult, but a celebration of a sort of vitality and maybe of a violence. But it's not explicit there. You'd have to read that document with a lot of hindsight to see what fascism was going to become. But Marinetti did write it, and he did become and remain a fascist. But he wasn't a conventional fascist in many ways. He was sort of a court jester to fascism. He stormed out of their big conference in 1920. He thought the fascists weren't being radical enough. He stood at an odd relationship to fascism, and he remained a futurist. So he also continued, particularly in the world of art, to try to celebrate what he saw as art that celebrated futurist values, which isn't particularly fascist. Even to take that kind of art seriously is not particularly fascist. And he stuck with futurism long enough to write in 1930, still a fascist, a cookbook, another famous, celebrated document, still much read, much discussed, widely cited, the Futurist cookbook, which, like the original Futurist Manifesto, it's hard to know how seriously to take it, because it clearly is partly designed to provoke, and some of it is definitely meant to be a joke. But it also seems to be pretty serious, and it's definitely not all a joke. And there is something very serious behind it, an idea of something behind it. And it's also very much about and for Italy. He was an internationalist, but he was also preoccupied with Italy being the place he thought it should be for the future. And in the Futurist cookbook, if the enemy in the manifesto is museums, that is what holds Italy back and drags Italy down. Museums and the haunting of the past. The enemy in the Futurist cookbook is pasta, which literally Marinetti says at considerable length. I mean, it really goes on, is weighing Italians down. Italians fit for the 20th century, fit for fascism, fit for what may be coming, the conflicts that may be coming, need to be sleek, and they need to be like machines. They need to be efficient, and food needs to be efficient. It also needs to be not beautiful, but aesthetically satisfying in a futurist way. I'll come on to that in a sec. But Italians need to be fitter, and pasta, Marinetti thinks, is like a dead weight on Italy, on its stomach. Heavy wheat, too much of it, too easy to eat too much of it. It's too slow. He's not into slow cooking, family cooking. He wants things. It may take time to prepare the kind of food that he's after. And some of the so-called recipes or meal plans in this book they are performance art, and they are unpreparable. But this is not a celebration of home and hearth and the joys of a good dish of pasta. This is Italy needs to get beyond that quick. He would ban pasta if he could. What would he put in its place? Well, the reason the Futurist cookbook is still celebrated is that it has some crazy stuff in it, and people still try and make these dishes or put on these performances. There are loads of them. I'll just give one example, partly because this one reminded me a little bit of Déjeuner sur l'herbe, that juxtaposition of a mimicking of the classic or the classical and the motifs of the classical in this form, and something really jarring. So the recipe is it's not a recipe. It's not a meal plan. It's an event. The event, the meal, says that it requires 3 men to sit in a garden, ideally a sort of leafy, bucolic garden, and they're to be dressed in white linen. And at one point it says, at this moment in the meal, a buxom, fresh-faced country maid will come in carrying a basket of strawberries. There's an image straight out of the official salon of 1863 or earlier. But the meal itself is this, I quote, "The meal will be a synoptic, syngustatory, whatever that means, plate of peppers, garlic, rose petals, bicarbonate of soda, peeled bananas, cod liver oil." Yum. And the men will eat that food while a woman walks around with a basket of strawberries, and the result will be what? The future? Art? Something jarring? It won't be pasta. If you try and see where Marinetti is now, like where has this ended up going beyond the cars? The Futurist cookbook is definitely still out there. Art galleries put on performance art displays in which people make these meals, and members of the public are invited to taste them. There was a celebrated version, the Guggenheim in New York, not that long ago. The food turns out to be disgusting, and people conclude, I don't know what they conclude. This is art, this isn't art. It's interesting. It's quite funny. The Futurist cookbook is also quite boring, and it's too long. It doesn't have the wonderful brevity of the Futurist Manifesto. I don't think he knew when to stop by that point. And also, the joke is really wearing thin. So in 1930, it was starting to wear thin. By the time fascism, the fascism that Marinetti helped to found, has allied itself with Nazism through the 1930s, there is no way to be a court jester anymore. You can't be a court jester to Hitler. And Marinetti, in his own life, becomes a grotesque figure. I mean, he is grotesque by the 30s. Part of the reason he's grotesque is he's still a fascist. And the Futurist cookbook is not funny anymore. Is it funny today? I don't know. A bit. But the other place that Marinetti comes up, if you were to Google him now, I say if you were, I did. He crops up a lot in relation to contemporary figures in Silicon Valley. So people associate Marinetti and futurism with Elon Musk. Elon Musk is sometimes considered to be a kind of grotesque or absurd figure in the futurist mold. But sometimes you also get the three M's, Marinetti, Musk, and Maloney. Maloney, who is politically not a million miles away from Italian fascism, though she has distanced herself more recently. Her origins are very much on the far right. She has cited Marinetti. There was a big picture of Marinetti at one of her party rallies when her party really was the far right. A little less than a decade ago, Marinetti was there as one of the icons of the movement. But it's also because he says what is probably the key thing for Lanzmann, the key thing that he wants not to explain but to describe. Hilberg says, the point about the Holocaust is almost none of it was new. Almost nothing that happened hadn't happened before to the Jews. The propaganda, the prejudice, the things that the Nazis said about them, the lies that they told, these all had centuries, millennia of history behind them. The old tropes, the old lies about the Jews. The ghettoization of the Jews had been done throughout history. The expulsion of the Jews, the expropriation of the Jews, the taking of Jewish property, the forcing of Jews to live together in a special part of town, the throwing of Jews out of their countries of origin, casting them out into the wilderness, the pogroms, the outbreaks of violence, the slaughter, the random acts of slaughter. None of this was new. What happened to the Jews in Nazi Germany has a long and deep history. Only one thing was new, Hilberg says: the deliberate, willful, bureaucratic program of total extermination. That was new. That was the step beyond which people had not been before. And that's the thing that Lanzmann is fascinated by. What the experience was of crossing that step, that threshold, from what you might say it was familiarity to a new kind of knowledge, an understanding that something new had happened. But the other reason I think he's fascinated by what Hilberg has to say is he makes clear this final step had to be improvised because there was no precedent for it. There was no guidebook to the total, willful, bureaucratic extermination of the Jews of Europe. So the Nazis had to make it up as they were going along. It was improvised, Hilberg says. The Holocaust was improvised, but at the same time, what made it unique, what made it unprecedented, is that it was a bureaucratic process. There had been improvised slaughters of the Jews throughout history on sometimes terrifying scales. Not this scale, but terrifying scales. What was new here was this was systematic. Because it was new, what was systematic also had to be improvised. And that is, I don't know what the word for it is. I think Lanzmann would reject all the words that I'm about to use. That is the puzzle. That is the mystery. That is the paradox. The systematic thing was improvised. The improvised thing was systematic. But there's something else going on here too, which Hilberg explains and which Lanzmann follows up on and through both parts of the film, which is the improvisation revealed to the Germans something about the process that they were trying to undertake, systematic extermination, which is that it would only work systematically if people didn't know what was going on. It had to be concealed. The truth of it, systematic extermination, had to be concealed for systematic extermination to be possible. And the concealment that Lanzmann's interested in here is not the cover-up, not the attempt by the Nazis to cover up all traces of the crime for posterity. That's not what he's interested in. He's interested in the events themselves and the fact that the Nazis discovered that killing on this scale, this kind of mechanized bureaucratic killing, for it to work, the one thing that is fatal is knowledge. Knowledge on the part of its victims will mean that the system breaks down, because the system only works when the people who are in the terrible bureaucratic language of the process being processed do not realize they are being processed for death. And so much of Shoah is about that, about describing that, describing a process in which the truth of it was being concealed from its victims in order that it should work. And what Lanzmann seems to want to know, as well as the what actually happened, and the how, he's very interested in the mechanics of this. And he gets particularly the Germans to talk about the mechanics. He wants to know the when, because at a certain point, that system reveals itself. A deliberate attempt to conceal from the victims of mass extermination that they are being processed for death, at some point reveals itself for what it is, even if it is just at the moment before death, the moment when the door of the gas chamber or of the truck in which you have been herded and are now being driven to your death because you are being poisoned with exhaust gas. Even if it is that moment, there is a moment when the truth is revealed. And so this is partly a film about the moment of revelation. It's not a ghoulish interest that he has in it. I'm pretty sure it's not a ghoulish interest. But it seems to him, I think, to Lanzmann, that this is the heart of the mystery. When could the thing be seen for what it was? When could it be seen by the victims, by the bystanders, by the perpetrators for what it was? And the answers are different. It is seen at different times. And also, in this eyewitness testimony, a lot of what we see on screen is people claiming that they didn't see it for what it was, that they couldn't tell that these trains were transporting people to their deaths, that these vans were actually death wagons, that they arrived at these camps, the Germans, and they didn't know what was happening there. And Lanzmann lets them say that, and then he waits for the moment, and we wait, and sometimes we have to be quite patient, for the moment when they say, and then I saw, and then I knew. The other thing that distinguishes part one from part two is a lot of part one of Shoah consists of interviews with Poles alive in the mid to late 1970s who saw this happening because they lived near the camps, near Treblinka, near Auschwitz, near Helmno, which is one of the focuses of part one. That was a camp where Jews were gassed in the back of vans. It was before the systematic gas chamber extermination. People who saw this because they were living there. One of the interviews is with the wife of the Nazi schoolteacher in one of the towns where the Jews were taken. And then it was known eventually that they were taken to their deaths in these vans in which they would be poisoned with exhaust gas. When did you know that this is what was happening, is Lanzmann's question. And he gets a variety of answers. We didn't know, but eventually, yes, we knew. And sometimes they say, smiling, and it was very sad. And some of the Poles who lived very near, some of them yards from the borders of these camps, they make clear they exactly knew what was going on. Some of them said, well, we tried to warn the Jews. We pulled our fingers across our throats as the trains went by. But at the same time, they are not reliable witnesses. So we hear a lot of descriptions of things that didn't happen, particularly from the Polish bystanders. They say things like, well, they were passenger trains that they were traveling in, so we couldn't know. And, the rich Jews were traveling first class. They weren't passenger trains. They were cattle trucks. And many of the people in these trains, by the time they came to the perimeter of the camps, were already dead because they had been systematically starved and deprived of water as part of the process of killing. The bystanders are horrifying. As witnesses, they are horrifying. The Polish government hated this film because they thought it made Poles look and sound complicit in the Holocaust. And no question that is part of Lanzmann's intention here, to make it clear that the bystanders knew and did nothing. What could they do? But they knew. And their attempts to say they didn't know do not last. Not his forensic grilling, because there's nothing forensic about it. It's just relentless. It's absolutely relentless. One of the strange things about watching this film now, I saw it when it came out in 1985. I was 18, I remember, spending 9 hours in the cinema with my mother, and it was harrowing. And then I watched it again recently. My experience of watching it recently is it feels so long ago. The witnesses that we are seeing, recorded in the mid to late 1970s, feel like they come from a very distant time. So the film came out in 85. That is exactly halfway between the events being described and where we are now. Came out 40 years after the end of the Second World War, and we're now roughly 40 years on from that. The interviews are usually more like 30 to 35 years on from the events being described. So some of those people being interviewed are in their 50s or 60s. They're not young, but they're also not old. They don't come across as old. Some of them come across as pretty robust. But they feel like they come now, seen now, from another world, a completely other time. And the interviews in rural Poland, they feel like they could have happened anytime. Over hundreds of years, these witnesses, Poles, farmers, they feel timeless. And part of the reason they feel timeless is they say things that are from any point in the whole history of Europe and the persecution of the Jews. Do you think, actually, that the longest term consequence of these revolutions is what you were talking about just a few minutes ago, which is the creation of a technocratic politics? And one way you could think about that is the social question that we talked about in relation to the radicalism of the revolution, what that meant before 1848. All of these people, many of them amateurs, sort of a piecemeal study, wide-ranging but not coordinated, all of these interrelated social questions, pressing on politics from the outside, some of it conservative, some of it radical, some of it socialist. The social question after 1848 got absorbed by the administrative state. And that's the biggest shift that follows right the way through to today. And in that is the origin not just of administration and technocracy, but actually of social democracy of a kind too. Just as you said, the state that builds as well as taking, that gives as well as taking, the state that is the instrument of piecemeal and non-radical but very important social change. Because there's some kind of understanding that there needs to be almost a contractual arrangement between the people who are governed and those who govern them, a give and take in that, and that this can be structured through statistics and administration and bureaucracy and a kind of professionalized civil service politics. It takes a long time to get from there to where we are now, and we are now maybe on the cusp of the dismantling of the administrative state. This might be a sort of 150-year plus story that's coming to an end. But the absorption of the social question by the state, if that was one of the consequences of 1848, that actually is the one that is the most profound.
I think it is a very profound consequence. I think that it's very interesting to think of these moments where technocracy emerges as an attractive solution. It's interesting to remember what it's a solution to. It was a solution because it seemed preferable to the conflictual politics of the 1840s. And a lot of people make this explicit. There's a well-known minister of finance in Portugal who says, we've left behind us the era of rhetoric and shooting, and we've entered into a new politics. And there's a lot of people talking about this. Marx and Engels write a big essay where they say, has anyone noticed how empty all those words that were being bandied about a couple of years ago, how empty these words turned out to be? Constitution, freedom, rights, family. It's all garbage. It's all that these words are only sonorous because they're empty, like drums. Let's move on and instead concentrate on a science of forces that is focused on where the real forces lie and how they're balanced. And of course, we know that will become part of what we call, or what Marx would call, scientific humanism. But, it's happening in other parts of the political spectrum as well. You also have liberals like August Ludwig von Rochau, who is the one that popularizes the term Realpolitik. And he says also that, a society is an assemblage of forces. And what matters in a society is the balance of those forces. In the end, politics will always simply reflect those forces. And you've got Bismarck saying that in future, the great decisions of the nation will not be resolved by parliamentary debates. They'll be resolved by blood and iron. It's, again, an appeal to forces. They mean different forces. Marx and Engels are talking about economic forces latent within class structures. And Rochau is talking about ideological forces and coalitions of sentiment and so on, and advocacy. And Bismarck is talking about military force and the projection of that kind of power. But they're all talking about force. So it's a move away from the appeal to ideals towards a kind of scientific appreciation of what is really there and how to manage those things that are actually really there and keep them in balance in a sort of well-tempered dissatisfaction that recommended itself as the way forward. And I think that these moments of technocracy, people hate technocracy, and it's trendy to be very down on it, but it's often an answer to something even worse. The next great wave of technocratic transformation will be after the Second World War. In fact, in some ways, the creation of the European, or what will become the European Union, into the steel and coal union, is a technocratic answer to what had been a conflictual problem, conflict over key resources. And so technocracy is attractive when it represents a preferable alternative to something worse. That, I think, explains the kind of wave-like quality of these moments of technocracy. You mentioned what's happening now, and of course, it's tempting to think of, Elon Musk in Washington as personifying a kind of technocracy, but I don't think it's nothing like those technocratic moments of the past, because in the past, technocracy was an instrument which tended to aggrandize the state. Whereas what's happening now is a sort of severing of that relationship between technical know-how and the state. The experts, who don't include Elon Musk, he's not really an expert at anything, but he's an entrepreneur who speaks in the name of branches of entrepreneurial activity that do depend on expertise. He's addressing himself against the state structure, not attempting to aggrandize it or make it do its work better. So we've entered a radically different moment.
But that's why I sort of feel that maybe a story that begins in 1848 is actually coming to an end now. One of the ironies of the long story is that at the end of the 20th century, it was the liberal democratic parliamentary, for want of a better word, version of that technocratic politics which had triumphed. It's triumphed against the Marxist version, even the Bismarck version. It's the one that in some ways is closer to a reconciliation of the forces of 1848. That was the end of history, period. But that too is now coming to an end. And for precisely the reasons you say, I think if we are entering a phase where technocracy means something outside of the state, then 1848 to until quite recently is a period of history with lots of ebbs and flows in it that is coming to an end. There is something that connected us 20 years ago to 1848, which may no longer be true in, never mind 20 years' time, 2 years' time.
Well, I don't want to share your what seems to be a very grim vision of even the very, very immediate future. I know that the word liberal has been sorely abused and emptied out and attacked and mocked and flagellated from all kinds of quarters, and everybody, it seems, saw some mileage in attacking liberalism in recent years. And of course, like every other political form, it's flawed and limited and so on. But I think that metapolitics, let's not even call it liberal. I mean, let's just call it a pluralist metapolitics of representation. I don't think it has exhausted its value, and I don't think it ever will, because when you take that representation away, what replaces it is capricious impositions by people in power. And then the question poses itself, which has been asked again and again and again since the early Middle Ages and actually since antiquity: what renders the exercise of power legitimate? Why should we accept this or that decision? Do we really want to revert to an environment in which politics, is absolutist in that sense and open to the play of caprice? I know that there are concerns about the current evolution of the situation in the United States. And of course, it is deeply shocking when someone who, he may not be formally part of the American administration, but when Elon Musk, for example, addresses the foreign minister of Poland and says to him, "Shut up, small man." I mean, that is a very shocking thing when people behave like that, unaccountably as it seems. But I don't think we should build that into the kind of death knell for liberal democracy, or, to avoid the word liberal, which seems to have become such a hate word, for that form of discursive pluralist politics that got us through some pretty nasty spots. It all depends on whether you think of that social and political order as fragile or as strong. And it seems to me, in the period since 1848, it's actually proved remarkably strong. It's never been very obvious why it should triumph, because mostly the liberals, and you think about the 1820s, the liberals didn't have armies. They didn't have armies in 1848. They were always losing in those kind of conventional measures of force and power, and yet somehow always at the same time winning. And there are reasons for that. That's not a reason for complacency. Obviously, we've got tons of things wrong, or we wouldn't be facing the situation we currently face. But I think we should be thinking about how to forearm the good things that we have against further deterioration and corrosion, rather than deciding, well, the baby's gone with the bathwater and we better think about a kind of post-democratic moment and how we'll survive that. I think there's still everything to fight for.
Just one more thing to add. You can also gift a subscription to PPF Plus, either 6 months or 12 months. It's coming up to that time of year when young people are taking exams. There may be people you know in schools, in colleges, at universities, thinking about what they want to do next, what they want to study next. This podcast is quite widely used in schools and colleges. If you want to give a gift to a young person in your life or to anyone you think might enjoy PPF Plus, just click on the link in the show description or go to our website, ppfideas.com. Tomorrow, it is one more selection of 5 episodes from the 50 available in the archive for you to sample. This has been Past, Present, Future.